Hey guys, today I'm going to talk to you today about a very interesting but challenging book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. Sogyal, yeah. And the author himself, he's a bit of a controversial figure. I don't know too well about his life, but I know he's controversial for some people. But this book was written in the 90s at some point, and it's basically a very interesting. It's a complex book, essentially, but it argues for a society where people die in a humane way. And this is going to preface. I should probably preface this. It's a Buddhist book written by a Tibetan Buddhist, and myself as a Buddhist as well. I'm going to agree with a lot of the stuff he says, but I can understand that other cultures and other religions won't fully see one to one with these kind of things. Ultimately, though, what he truly argues is for we need to have a better, more holistic view of death. He talks about in the book the very interesting experiences that Tibetan Buddhists go through with death. He describes in his book how he saw a member of his family or some senior lama of his essentially die, and then when the priest or the lama went over and sort of said a few words of encouragement, it kind of actually brought the person back to life and sent him over to the other side in a very peaceful way. It's a very interesting relationship the way Tibetan people have with death. They don't see it as an ending as we do in the West, or this kind of sad, grievous thing. It's this transition. It's this gentle thing. They talk about death as being like a dog knowing that it needs to die, or a lion that knowing that it goes to die. It just goes out and crawls into a cave and dies, and that's it. It's not a big momentous thing. It's not a certain ending. It's just a simple. It's a transition, as though it would be putting on clothes or cutting one's hair. And what he puts forward is basically that in the West, when someone dies, it's a very invasive, sort of medically laden affair. Someone's plugged up with all these chemicals, all these drips. They're stuck full of needles, and they're on like a heartbeat monitor, and they're sort of unallowed to die in a natural way. They're sort of monitored constantly until there's some scientific veracity. Then they've died and then they've passed on. But he argues for a way of death where it's a gentle, easy transition, where one can sit in a room and be with the person and see the person as they die, not be separated from that death, but when the person can be with their loved ones, they're not in pain or in fear or surrounded by doctors or being pumped for the drugs, keep them living for another 10 days more. And this spoke to me a lot, and I'm definitely thinking we're going to come back and read this when my parents start getting to the age of dying as well. My grandfather, he suffered from Parkinson's, and when he was seeing him die and pass away like that, it was like just seeing someone just become essentially hollow, just seeing someone become a shadow of their former self. And when he was in the hospital at the end of his days, just plugged up full of monitors and just, yeah, just it wasn't a life. It wasn't a life. But my grandfather ended up living up from someone who, was a man with issues, but still a great man, a man that I do love, I did love, but with a man with a lot of issues as well, but a man who, who supported a family, who did good things, who was really quite a very interesting guy, and really quite a source of joy for our whole family to see him fade and wither away into this just shell of a not even a human being, just this vegetable. It kind of spoke to me how like that is a risk that my parents are gonna end up like that. My mum might have Parkinson's. Her hands sometimes shakes as well, and I think it is genetic, so it could be very well the case. My mum and she forgets things. My mum may well end up developing Parkinson's, and I'm becoming to a point where what quality of life are we arguing for? What is a life worth living at the end of the days? My mum's so active; she's still working out today. I don't mean any other 50 something, um, Indian woman who are sort of lifting weights and getting after it. Still, my mum is so active, and to see her fade away eventually, and to go down the same route my grandfather did. Mind you, my grandfather was more stubborn and more kind of like set in his ways as well, which didn't contribute to, which only aided in his decline as well. He wasn't sensible. But seeing this potentially happen to my mother as well is quite a terrifying prospect. So this book, it provides some real sage advice on just accepting dying, how to be with a dying person. These are all real heavy subjects, but we don't talk about this shit. We're so scared of dying, we don't talk about it. We think death is a dirty word. And it's the most ridiculous thing, because how much suffering, how natural is it that everyone dies? There's a parable or message or a story of the Buddha who said, this woman was grieving, who came to the Buddha and said, my baby's child, my newborn infant has died, please bring him back to life. And the Buddha said, go in the city and ask everyone here in these houses if someone in these houses hasn't asked from a mustard seed, or something very small, a mustard seed from a house. if nobody has died in that house, basically, and bring it to me, and then I'll bring the son to life. And the woman went off searching, and every single house she came to, everyone knew of someone who had died in that house. And she came back to the Buddha having understood the lesson that everyone, it's the most human experience to die, in a sense. We don't talk about it enough. We always associate death with an ending, with a certainty, with a coldness, when death is really just a transition onto a new life, a new form, of reincarnation. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation, whatever your interpretation of death is, we have to get real with it and sit with it, and not run from it or hide from it or distract ourselves from it. One day your parents are going to die. Are you going to be ready for that? Because I certainly wasn't for most of my life. I've not been ready for that. Now when I meditate sometimes, I meditate on the fact they're going to die. A very good style of practice I've started doing is when I've been just been with my parents, or I'm in the garden reading a book, my dad's gardening, or I'm just sitting having dinner or something, and my mum's doing something in the kitchen. I just look at them, not saying anything, just look at them and think, one day they're going to die. One day they're not going to be doing that thing anymore, and they're not going to exist. And I just, this feeling of love and so much gratitude for having them in my life just wells up. When they die, I could be there to do the last rites. I could be there to take their ashes to the Ganges, or for my father's case, I think he wants to be scattered somewhere in Kenya. I'm not too sure yet how to discuss that. Who are you going to be? Are you going to be someone who's going to crumble and just be, not to say I won't grieve, but I've got to be ready to face death in the face. If I can be ready to face my own death, this book does recommend to meditate on one's own death, and I'm of mixed views of that, because it can be kind of destructive and can be kind of enlightening as well, but I'll touch on that later. But it's a very powerful book on a subject that is just not talked about. Like, how do we treat our dead? How do we respect those who are dying? It talks about the hospice movement as well, which for people who are in like terminal conditions who can't be cured, essentially. How do we ease them to that kind of just transition from life into death into the next stage? And then it also talks very in depth about bardos, which are these states are becoming in Tibetan Buddhism. There's one from being born to death, which we call life. There's one from death till the sort of next life, which is sort of the interstice period, and then from that next when you choose you're born into the next realm, and then from the next realm into being born again in that realm. There's sort of three periods these junctions where you go through essentially in going through death as well. And while it's hard to sit here and say, there's no scientific veracity for that, there's definitely something beyond all this, and I definitely do believe in reincarnation, because it's the way of the universe. Atoms are never destroyed. Everything's reincarnated in a true sense. But this book, I've read this now, I'm thinking, okay, when my parents get around that age, they're getting old, we're talking about the end of life, they've written their will, but they're talking about all these things. I don't know if I'm going to have that luxury in a sense as well. I don't know if I'm going to have the luxury. Not to say I'm thinking of my parents' death 24/7, but I have to be honest with myself. Nothing's permanent. Nothing lasts forever. Everything is in an interstice. I just want to be ready when it comes to that point. When it comes to the point of my parents lying there in a hospital bed. What kind of man am I going to be? Am I going to be ready to accept that burden? I'm not going to be there to support my sister. I'm going to be there to do the last rites and be the right son for them. It just came to me at a very powerful time, because this really allowed me to explore. And it also just heavily talks about, outside the death aspect, just some good aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, his practice, his ways, the really interesting things. I really like Tibetan Buddhism because the way it sort of marries together, Theravada Buddhism and sort of like, the sort of Indian side of things, with their own interesting Tibetan kind of cultural ways of being, the kind of the belief in the spirits, the belief in the dragpa, which are these kind of like spirits that you can summon up, these ideas of like, or the way his meditation practices, it's very much based on the mountains and the sky. When you're seated, your body is the mountain, and your mind, your Buddha nature is the sky essentially. And you have to imagine it like, thoughts will come in, emotions will come in, it'll just be like a cloud passing through the sky. And he talks about some really good practices about like Ringpa practices, such as like as one where you focus on like a deity, or it could be Buddha himself, or like another deity that you believe in as well, and you kind of like activate your heart chakra, and you sort of, if you're suffering, you kind of pour outwards. Not that one. It's another practice I found very powerful actually. Tongyal, is it? Let me find the contents. It's a practice called, I should have probably taken notes of this. It's a kind of compassion practice called, remember what it's called. It's called. I'll have to just look this up 1 second. Practice. Tonglen, yeah, right. It's Tonglen meditation, which is essentially sort of talking and sending, where you imagine someone. I had some issues with my boss, for example. Some stuff happened at work, and I was very angry with my boss, and other people as well in my life, my sister or anyone else. This practice of Tonglen he talks about, which is I think Tibetan for sending and taking, where you sit in your meditation center, you enter into your meditation posture, and you imagine the person whom you have a difficulty with, an anger with, kind of anything with. It could be a person you love as well. It could be a person you have difficulty with. It could be a person who's departed. I've done this with many different people. I've done this with people I'm angry at. I've done this with people who are angry at me. I've done this with people I like. I've done this with people who I don't like. I've done this with my parents. I've done this with my grandparents who have passed, well, my grandfathers who have passed away. I've done this sort of practice where I've sat there, imagine them, and just imagine sort of taking the negative karma. Just imagine sort of being clouded in this purpley kind of like energy and taking that within you, taking this negative karma. It can be even more done. It can be done to a larger extent as well. If you're an addict like me, and you know the horrors of drug addiction, or you've been through that shit, or you're even in them now, you could sit here with Tonglen, or if you've got I think he talks about having like aggressive illness like cancer or AIDS. But if you're suffering from any kind of chronic condition, even depression, even anxiety, even bipolar, sit there and think you want to take on it sounds counterintuitive, but you want to take on aboard all these negative aspects. You take the suffering of all these people who have these same conditions as you. When I sit there and think I want to take on all the pain, all that anger, all the distress, all the fucking chaos these addicts may be suffering, or people with depression may be suffering, taking that on board myself, and sort of transmitting. It's hard to explain really, but I imagine taking in this dark, negative, purpley kind of gassy energy and expelling out this kind of kindness, this light, this white, bright light energy, to either this person, if I'm directing it to a person, or to these people. Fuck it. I've even done it for Vladimir Putin. I've even sometimes thought, fuck it, just sit there, try and contemplate Vladimir Putin, this big evil person who really is just in a sense a person, right or wrong, he's a person driven by kind of fear in a sense. There's probably no person more scared in the world than that person, because he knows when this regime comes down, his head's on the line. But anyways, let's get outside the remit. But even imagining someone like that and trying to take on their kind of negativity, trying to take on their kind of like their pain, their suffering and fear, and sending out with your karma, this kind of like love or compassion. And it's such a freeing practice in the same way like metta practice. And I'll do a video on that, like a metta practice guide meditation, because I find metta really helpful as well. But this Tonglen, this taking and receiving, it's really transformative, because it makes you aware of everyone's sufferings, but also it makes you aware of how universal that kind of suffering is. And coming back to the message of this book, nothing's more universal than death in a truer sense. It's so equalizing, it's so grandstanding, and so it's almost psychedelic in a way, in the way that it's just kind of like it really makes everything. It makes reality crystallize when you sit on your own death. It makes everything more important. I'm gonna preface this. I don't think everyone should do this practice, but what I've done, I've sometimes sat down in my meditation posture and thought, okay, imagine this is the last day you're going to be alive, and then when you go to sleep tonight, you're going to die. Just imagine that. Just comprehend that. What would that feel like? What would that actually be like? And I always it's always the same, I always first think, what would I do if this is the last day I had to live? I'd go outside for a walk. I'd be with my family, I'd spend time with people. I'd go out into nature. I'd be like looking at every single leaf and touching every single tree, thinking this is the last time I could do this, I'd be drinking it all in, thinking about how. And that gratitude that brings up, a deep groundswell of gratitude that brings up from doing that practice, thinking of your death, thinking of where this might take me, It's so powerful. It really, if you're ever in a shitty place, you're not where you want to be, just think to yourself, imagine this is the last day you got left, you're going to die tonight in your sleep. And imagine that, and imagine what that would feel like. That is a powerful practice. And a more negative experience I've had, and this, I should be preface this, don't do this if you've got issues with depression or suicide or whatnot. If you're not in a mentally stable place, I don't think you should be meditating, at least not in the way I do it. But if you're in a good stable place in your practice and you're confident in this, try to imagine it as though you are already dead. That's kind of a scary thing to do. And one time I've done it where I've actually tried it and soaked in and almost I think had a kind of ego death experience where I just became. It's really hard to explain, and I've only had that other experience on acid as well, which was also a bizarre ego death. I just remember being This was an acid, not meditation, mind you, but I remember looking down this tunnel of white light and I just ended. I wasn't there. I didn't exist anymore. I just stopped existing in a sense. Oop. Fucking getting too emotionally caught up in my speech there. I just stopped existing in that sense. Sorry, you can tell I get fucking passionate about this shit. I stopped existing in that sense, and that was quite a scary experience. But in the meditation practice, it wasn't so much the fear of not existing, just the fear of not. I was just so grateful to come back to it when I was meditating. I don't recommend the psychedelics or any of that kind of stuff. If you want to go ahead and take them, I'm not going to stop you, but those things need to be used so carefully, and I didn't use them carefully, so I steer clear of all that nowadays. There are other ways to like sort of get another rush, and a better one as well. But yeah, no, when I'm meditating on my own death and meditating on that fact, I came to this back to here when my practice ended, and I was so grateful. I kind of curled up in my bed and cried for a little bit as well, because it was just so jarring and frightening as well in some sense. But also, I was so grateful to be alive. I was so grateful to be experiencing everything. And yeah, this book makes a great case for all these things, accepting our death and everything else's death, and treating that with more humility, with more kind of, understanding, not trying to plug someone up full of wires and devices and trying to prolong a life just for the sake of a few more days or a few more weeks, because that might amount to more suffering, It's going to sound incredibly harsh to say, but my grandfather, I don't know if he'd have wanted it, but the whole terminal illness and right to live sort of thing, or right to end one's life, is such a confusing thing. But I do think there's something to be said about if someone's in suffering and they're not living a human life, they're fucking shit in their pants, they're not able to take care of themselves. Is that life? Do we prolong that? I don't know. This is such a hard question. I mean, if it comes to me with the fact that if I end up developing Parkinson's and I know I'm going to be going down this slow decline, or I could choose to end my life in an ethical way with all my affairs sorted out, then I'd rather do that. I wouldn't want to be a burden on my children. I wouldn't want to be a burden on other people or the state, and sit there suffering as I slowly rot away from the inside. I've seen that. It's horrifying. It's terrifying, It's a real death in a sense. Death in a sense is kinder than that kind of decay of a person you just see from their brain and everything go out, and that's something I've got to contend with as well. With my mother or father develop any kind of long-term issues like that, I've got to be there with that. But I'm gonna have this book by my side to reread again, and guide me through those dark times. This has been a very difficult subject and quite a dark one to talk on, but yeah, I'm passionate about it, because if we don't have these difficult conversations, this never gets addressed and this gets swept under the carpet. I think we as a society, British society, Western society, we need to have a real discussion about what death is, and really actually be there with, the people who are actually going through it, because it's ultimately probably one of the most important questions, how we die. We don't know how, but, death and how we deal with our dead, it's going to really determine the fate of a future society as well. But I'm glad I'm able to talk out with you guys, and I'm so grateful to discuss it here. So, take care, guys. And remember, choose purpose over pleasure.